Hello, my name is Zahar Karetsky, and this is the Transitions Visions podcast, a podcast series about and for the sustainability transitions community. Anyone working on sustainability transitions is probably motivated by the realization that humans have been destroying the planet and have been doing not nearly enough to mitigate this destruction. This urgency to do something about the climate crisis and its impacts, present in sustainability transitions research, has been complemented by more recent calls for just transitions, which is itself not a new topic. Injustice in transitions is very visible today, with the results of many elections in Europe and beyond, where people are calling for justice and against stopping the entire industries without regard for the workers. So for this episode, I talked to Natascha van Bommel, who recently published a paper on this topic exactly. Natascha is my colleague in Eindhoven University of Technology, and she works as postdoc on energy transitions. We talked about energy justice and climate justice and the difference there. We talked about the transnational dimension of justice. We also talked about the fact that this is not merely an academic debate, but also is actually very practical, about the injustice of being able to afford not to feel the urgency to act. And we also talked a bit about her research in India and Europe that has triggered Natascha's interest in this topic. So please enjoy, and I invite you to send me your comments and questions and possibly topics for future episodes. You can reach me on Twitter. You can find the link in the podcast profile page, but you can also contact me on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. I saw your recent paper in ICE, together with Johanna Hofken, The Urgency of Climate Action and the Aim for Justice in Energy Transitions.
Yes.
And it is really topical to, at least it seems to me, and I wanted to discuss this paper with you and also your ideas about these big topics.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose none of us wants the environment to collapse, but also none of us wants a green totalitarianism, hopefully.
Yes.
So, but maybe, coming up to this topic, where does your interest in the topic combining urgency and climate come from?
There's two reasons. First of all, I have always been interested in climate change politics, and also that's where my interest in energy transitions also comes from. And I've always also been a little bit frustrated by the fact that my interest started when I was 15, and still it feels like not that much has changed. So I feel that urgency myself very much. But then I started working in my PhD on energy communities and energy justice. And I noticed that in many conferences and also by many scholars, a lot of emphasis is placed on energy justice issues on a very local level within Europe, which I think is extremely important. For example, when windmills are only placed close to local communities who do not really reap the benefits of these windmills, I think it's very important to think about these issues. But at the same time, I also conducted research in the Indian Sundarbans, where climate change is a super urgent issue because it's a delta region. Most of the islands are the maximum amount of meters is 3 level above sea level. So it's a very urgent issue there. And then from a justice perspective, urgency is very much needed in energy transitions. So I was very interested from the research that I've been doing in this tension between that on the one hand, in the context of the Sundarbans, you would argue that because of climate justice, we need to be rapid with energy transitions and climate action policies. And on the other hand, I see that justice scholars in the context of Europe have a very different focus, and focus also a lot on, okay, let's not go too quick and too fast, because we really need to think about how we're gonna organize this new energy system and that we don't repeat the injustices that we have created in the previous energy system. So yeah, this tension I find very interesting, and that's also why I started working on this paper.
You already mentioned climate justice and energy justice and just transitions. Could you give a little? Could you say what's the commonalities between them? What the differences are between them?
Yes. So climate justice and energy justice are two concepts that both stem from the notion of environmental justice. And environmental justice, I think the concept arose in the 70s or something in the United States, because it was very noticeable that certain facilities that, for example, polluted the air, or like waste management facilities, were always located near black communities or marginalized communities. And so the costs of these facilities were mainly on these more marginalized communities, while the benefits were for the white and the rich communities. And that's where environmental justice movements arise from. And this has become a notion also in academia to kind of pinpoint this phenomenon. And from that, different types of justice movements arise. Climate justice movement is one of the big movements there. And I think in 2010 or 12 or something, the notion of energy justice also arose as a notion to focus on the benefits and the costs of energy systems. And then just transitions, that's also essentially an activist movement, but with a completely different scope. So this arose also, I think, in the 70s by labor unions who wanted to ask attention for the fact that when there are these sustainability transitions, people are losing their jobs. A lot of people are dependent on fossil fuel industries, and these workers are can also be very marginalized and can also have a lot of disproportional impacts of this transition away from fossil fuels. So that's really a labor movement, and this has become a more general term, I think, in the past few years, where it's also used to describe just rather than focusing on sustainability transitions, there also needs to be a justice component there. Yeah, so how I use them in my work is that climate justice I use to focus on the impacts of climate change and who has caused climate change, who feels the impacts of climate change, and how this causes injustices. For energy justice, I focus on energy technologies, energy infrastructures, and energy systems, and along the full value chain of these energy systems, where energy injustices occur and how they can be mitigated. And for just transitions, I focus on how transitions create certain injustices. So that's how I split the three in my research.
And is it also how literature categorizes it?
Not fully. There is this idea that just transitions can kind of include all the different concepts. I choose not to do that because I think that the focus on the impacts of transitions on its own is very important to add to the conversation. And when it becomes this one big umbrella concept, I fear that you lose some of the nuances that all these different perspectives can bring.
So I will ask you now in detail about the aspects of your paper and your argument, but maybe just to start off, very kind of bold and the million-dollar question. So is it possible to kind of have both justice and quick transitions?
That's indeed $1 million question. I think you cannot have a quick transition without focusing on justice. And I also don't think you can have a just transition without focusing on the speed of the transition. However, there needs to be a balance there. So I don't think you can have a super quick, super just transition. I think that's a utopia.
So now going into detail. So under which, in fact, conditions is it all right to speed ahead? And also the other way around, under which conditions is it best to be slower, but work on justice?
Yeah. So I think I cannot say under which conditions, because that's very context dependent. However, I think it is important that right now there's a lot of focus on how the two jeopardize each other. So how justice jeopardizes an urgent transition or a speedy transition, and the other way around. And I think there needs a lot more focus. There needs to be a lot more focus on how the two can enable or reinforce or really help each other. So there is often this idea that inevitably speed in an energy transition will lead to injustices. But there should also be a focus on the injustices that will happen in the future if we are not speedy with the energy transition. And similarly, if we do not focus on justice in energy transitions, there will be a huge backlash, and political parties will be elected that are not fond of energy transitions at all. So if we don't focus on the fair distribution of these impacts of energy transitions, like for example, people living in small villages who are dependent on cars will have a much higher impacts of higher fuel prices than people living in a city. I think we do need to focus on that. However, it cannot be a reason to stop going forward with energy transitions.
Yeah, so, and do you see this argument also showing up in sort of cases, in empirical cases? The balance argument.
No, so what I think is that a lot of empirical cases focus on the local justice impacts of a certain energy transition measure or energy transition policy. So it is about how a local community is impacted by, for example, a hydropower facility, or by a park of windmills, or by a field of solar panels, or other ways. And these are very legitimate concerns, but I feel like a lot of case studies do not then also zoom out to the bigger picture. So I think a lot of attention goes to these very local impacts, and while important, I think the balance might be a bit off there.
But do you see the argument for urgent transitions? So you mentioned before that justice could be an argument for urgent transitions.
Yes.
Or more, yes. Do you? Is it purely an academic argument, or is it also an argument from somebody from the group anywhere in the world that you have noticed?
I think this is a key argument of the climate justice movement. Yeah. So both go hand in hand, of course. There's a climate justice movement, and there is this academic framework on climate justice. But they are, I think, very much inspired by each other. But yeah, from a climate justice perspective, there is a lot of urgency to continue with a speedy energy transition. And I think very important, there is also the voice of youth, who feel very underrepresented in policy decision making on energy transitions, and who feel like, and it's not all youth, of course, but a part of the youth, and who feel like a lot of old people are in very powerful positions making decisions about other people's futures. So I think this urgency, this call for urgency is very much rooted in also the climate justice movements, yeah.
A big part of the article actually
Mm-hmm.
is the dynamics, right, between
Mm-hmm.
justice and energy.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of questions of justice creating public support for urgent issues. Could you say a bit more about this dynamic? What does this dynamic amounts to?
Yeah, so maybe to introduce it a bit more, so what we have talked about right now is how there are many different elements that should be included when talking about urgency and justice. And in the literature, I found about 15 articles that say something about urgency and justice, but they never really go in depth. So what I did in this article is I used these three justice conceptualizations, so climate justice, just transitions, and energy justice. And I looked at different elements within these justice frameworks and how they relate to urgency. And then I wrote down per justice aspect what the relation with urgency can be. And what I found there is that there are two main dynamics. So an enabling dynamic in which rapid energy transitions can enable justice and vice versa. So a focus on justice in energy transition can also enable a more speedy energy transition. And at the same time, I found that there are jeopardizing dynamics. So a focus on justice can also jeopardize the speed of an energy transition, because you do to really, for example, focus on fair procedures and fair decision making, you need to include different perspectives, and that just costs time, and vice versa also. So these are two dynamics, and I feel like there is often a focus on this jeopardizing dynamic. Well, I think if we focus a bit more on how they can actually enable each other, that also gives a more positive story, but also room to really have this reinforcing power there.
You mentioned something very interesting in your recommendations. You mentioned that it's recommended to go along the value chains and beyond nation states. Could you say a bit more about this argument or this recommendation?
Mm-hmm. And so I think a key element of energy justice, and maybe also of climate justice and just transitions, is that it gives the potential to look at different scales and also different timelines. And when looking at different scales, that also means that you can look at how a very local energy project can have impacts in all along the value chain of that project. So, for example, a solar PV technology has a very big value chain, and also there's a lot of waste disposal related to solar PV. And this goes for energy, any technology, of course, but also for energy technologies. And I think it's important when making policies that these considerations are also included, and not just the impacts of energy transitions locally. Mm-hmm. For example, there's a European policy, a European Commission policy on the right to repair. Mm-hmm. This is one kind of policy that not only takes into account that products are safe, for example, and that the user of the product can use the product in a nice way, but also it is a policy that focuses on the afterlife of a product. And the right to repair means that products need to be repairable, meaning that the lifespan of that product can lengthen. And I think that's an example of a policy that goes a bit beyond, okay, what's happening here locally, but looks at, okay, but what are also the impacts of when we dispose of products every year, and a lot of waste disposal is shipped to other countries. And so I think it is possible with policies to also take responsibility there of the justice issues connected to these value chains. That could be an example.
So in this sense, it's not only about miners and in the coal industry. Justice is also about global South countries versus global North countries who export waste, e-waste, for example. So there is this multi kind of transnational element to justice.
Which is, of course, also not very new. I mean, climate change, I think that's very widely known, is a problem that transcends both nation states, borders, and also generations. So it's also, maybe a bit of an open door, but it's very important, I think, to emphasize, because in the justice discourses very often this focus stays very local. And I think that's a bit problematic. Yeah.
Is it also one of your recommendations then to expand the focus, the scope of climate justice, not climate justice because it's makes sense, but for, let's say, energy justice and just transitions?
Yes, that's one of the recommendations, and one of the recommendations is also to look beyond energy transitions if you want to tackle justice issues. So that's another recommendation, in the sense that so energy systems are rooted in the way that we organize societies, and if there is an urgency to transition in this energy system, to transition towards another energy system, then in this urgency it is very likely that So because there are so many inequalities in society already, in a transition that's urgent and in urgent decision making, it's very likely that these injustices will perpetuate or exacerbate or redistribute. So the existence of these injustices is not only linked to energy systems and energy technologies, but it's a wider societal problem that I think we can also not solve purely with an energy transition. And therefore I also think that it's very unlikely that an energy transition will be without injustices. And therefore I do think that we need to pick our battles a little bit. And then with we, I mean, again, scholars, but also policymakers, of course. But I'm referring to scholars, and also in the justice literature, it's very important that there is more attention to also maybe weighing or balancing the importance of different justice issues that we bring to the forth in our academic papers. Because if we bring to the fore a plethora of energy justice issues in academic papers without putting a weight on it, or without making a normative statement about the importance of one issue compared to another justice issue, then it becomes impossible to navigate this, because then everything you do will have a justice consequence, and you don't know how to measure the importance of that certain justice consequence. So I think that's also a important recommendation of my in my conclusion. Yeah.
And here you just mentioned structures of energy production, and it kind of reminds me of Jason Hickel's call for critique of the energy system, but not only the energy system, as a way to deal with both urgency and justice. You also, in your paper, you touch upon, or you actually go in detail on tactics of delay through appealing to more justice.
Yeah.
So like politicians calling for, okay, we need to stop, we need to sit down and think about whether it's right.
Yeah.
What did you find on that? And how do we sort of recognize and counter this
Yeah, so I found one paper in which the authors analyzed tactics of climate delay by politicians, and very often politicians also appeal to justice discourses as a tactic of delay. And this is not super obvious, so they are not literally stating that something is unjust, but they will appeal to things like hardworking families. They have a right to go on holiday by plane, so we cannot impose a carbon tax on airplanes because this would impact hardworking families. So often policymakers appeal to this. It's a call to justice. It's not directly mentioning that it's unjust, but that is one of the tactics, and I think it's also a bit subtle, and I think it speaks to a lot of people, and also true in some ways. But it's interesting that that's where they choose to put their focus on, and then they kind of go by the fact that in the future. There will be a lot more inequalities because of climate change if we do not take action now. But it's easy to not include that in the conversation and just focus on this one aspect of justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the populist, I guess, part of the argument.
Yes, and not just populist. I think you can see this in many different parties. So it's... Yeah, it is populist, but I think it's also a concern of many politicians.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it doesn't give the full picture of the actual problem and the impacts of going quick or not. So I wouldn't say it's just a populist argument, but I do think that it's not a fair argument. I conducted fieldwork in Europe within 3 different energy communities, and there I focused on social acceptance of energy technologies and also on energy justice. What I noticed when doing this study is also myself that it's very easy to focus on the very local level, especially when you're studying communities. So that's already a community level. And I think another important aspect there is also social acceptance. So that's also why there is also from the point of policymakers a bit more focus on justice now, because energy communities are seen as a vehicle to create social acceptance because they are a more just way of organizing energy systems. But that also is a very local focus. What I found in this study and more specifically also in the literature review that I conducted around this study is again that the focus on justice is very local in these studies on energy communities, while the premise of the concept of energy justice is a lot bigger and more global. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also where this contradiction came from when I was looking at my other case study in the Indian Sundarbans. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So this paper that is the topic of our discussion is actually kind of a result of your dissatisfaction with your previous research. You're very localized.
Well, yes, kind of. Yeah. I mean, in this paper, and in this research, I also tried to zoom out, and I also proposed to look at energy communities at different levels. So not only within, but looking also about what happens beyond when studying justice and energy communities. So I think that's just also a general theme in my thinking during my PhD. One big component of justice is this lack of injustice, is this lack of urgency. And the whole fact that there are so many different perceptions on urgency, and some people have a sense of urgency while others don't, that in itself is already an injustice, because it means that some people can afford to not be stressed about climate change while others cannot. So I think that's already an injustice. So I think the two are so connected with each other that I won't choose between one of them.
But that's a great point. I also was curious, so what's your current research and what are your future topics?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on the Dutch heat transition. I'm starting up my research, so I started with my postdoc a few months ago. And I'm not really focusing on either urgency or justice, but I'm focusing on the role of municipalities in facilitating and creating this heat transition, and also the dilemmas that they face, considering that on the one hand it's interesting to go for more collective solutions. On the other hand, this is not possible everywhere. You need to have a business case, and at the same time, people are already investing in individual heat pumps. So, yeah, these tensions I'm working out. Yeah.
So still around the topic of energy,
yeah.
A bit of a different direction. Do you plan to go back at one point to the topic of urgency and justice?
I don't know. That really, depends on what comes along my path. Yeah.
On the funding streams. Yeah.
Exactly.
The idea of this podcast is also to have a conversation with or at least have a possibility for transitions PhDs to get excited about transitions, but also get some lessons from doctors already. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you can share one lesson that you from your PhD trajectory that you you're proud of, or maybe you would do differently looking back.
Mm-hmm. I think you have to do something that you're really interested in and very much like, and at the same time you have to be sure that you don't make it too important as a component of your life. So especially when working on energy transitions and on climate change issues, it can sometimes feel so important and so daunting as well, and also a bit depressing at times. So yeah, you have to really keep this work-life balance very strictly, I think. Especially when working on transition studies or energy justice or all these important topics. Sustainability, yes.
Did you manage to keep your work-life balance?
I think so, yes. Okay. I think I did a pretty good job there. Yeah. Also, I just really like to go out on a bicycle ride, or go on, I don't know, a walk, or just be outside already helps a lot with also not making your own work too important, because even if I think it's very important what I say, it's it's still a minor contribution, of course, to what's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully, current PhDs will not have another pandemic, because that would make their lives much easier than.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Natascha.